Today, we are continuing our series about the Capitol itself. As you know, the Capitol Historical Society, chartered by Congress over 60 years ago, is charged with telling the story of the Capitol and the people who work in it in a manner that inspires informed patriotism. We think that that means that we tell the stories about this magnificent building, which is both a museum and an operating office building, and the work of the people who are there. Today, we have joining us the 10th architect of the Capitol, Alan Hantman. He will be discussing his newly released book, Under the Dome: Politics, Crisis, and Architecture in the United States Capitol. Our domed United States Capitol is recognized around the world as America's most iconic symbol, the forum for representative democracy, the physical stage for the transfer of executive power. As the United States grew in size and complexity, the Capitol was built, rebuilt, enlarged, and extended many times, always under the direction of the very few who have been the architect of the Capitol. This official heads the agency dedicated to preserving and upgrading this magnificent structure and all of the buildings and grounds that constitute Capitol Hill. In Under the Dome, Alan Hantman, who served as architect of the Capitol from 1997 to 2007, provides a personal account about how the Capitol works as a physical space, who runs it, how and why decisions are made about the security of the Capitol, the security of the people who work there, how politicians think about the Capitol building. He also recounts serious security threats to the Capitol during his tenure, including the 1998 shooting that resulted in the murder of 2 police officers, the Capitol evacuation on 9/11 as a hijacked airplane approached that underscore some of his greatest challenges as the architect of the Capitol. The tension between securing the Capitol and opening it to the public drove the design and direction of the Capitol Visitor Center, which was overseen and guided by Alan Hantman. Alan Hantman was appointed the architect of the Capitol for a 10-year term. As the architect of the Capitol, he created detailed valuations and master plans for each of the 9 jurisdictions that fall under the responsibility of the architect of the Capitol. He provided an overall roadmap for phased renovations and growth, including plans for the restoration of our iconic cast iron dome. Alan Hantman oversaw the detailed design and construction of the 580,000 square foot Capitol Visitor Center, which increased the size of the U.S. Capitol by 70%, building an entire facility underground. He also oversaw the reconstruction and expansion of the Botanical Gardens, the Capitol Power Plant, and the design and construction of the National Guard. This is an impressive individual with some fascinating stories to tell. So it is now my honor to present to you Alan Hantman, who will talk to us about his work. Alan?
I think I'm here, Jane. Thank you so much.
You are.
I appreciate that warm and generous introduction, and thank you certainly to Sam and Vincent for all your support in putting this together. I've always valued the Society's mission and about educating the public on the heritage, the history of the Capitol, its institutions, and those who served them over time. Many of you on this webinar have invested years in learning about the Capitol, in walking its halls and honoring the 230-year flow of history it has served. I honor that effort and commitment, and I thank you all for coming here together today. In this sense, my mission in writing Under the Dome totally coincides with yours. Okay. Okay, if I've got the technical part right, we should be getting into the slide presentation. Wonderful. Okay. Fine. Can everybody see this now? Let me.
We got it.
We got it. Okay, we're ready to go then. Let me move on to the first real slide, and one that I think all of us will enjoy. I remember when I was a candidate for architect of the Capitol, and I came in the night before my first interview. I came out of Union Station, and there in the arch was etched against the sky the dome of the United States Capitol. It's an image that I'll never forget. It's something that really was powerful and remains powerful. In the foreground here on the east side of the Capitol is the entryway to the doorway to democracy, the Capitol's new underground visitor center. Looking back in my decade on Capitol Hill, I take great pride in seeing that this, the largest expansion of the Capitol in its 230-year history, is now a reality, recognized as a fully integral part of life on Capitol Hill. More about that a bit later, its design and its construction that increased the size of the Capitol by some 70%. But just look at that magnificent building, that dome crowning the top. It's recognized around the world as America's most iconic symbol, serving as a multi-use stage supporting Congress's operations. It's the forum for our representative democracy, where we mourn presidents and others of note, where figures of national and international significance are welcomed and celebrated, and where citizens can observe their government in action or inaction, as the case may be. It is the physical stage for our peaceful quadrennial transfer of executive power from one president to the next, as the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court administers the oath of office, a foundational part of our democracy. Perfect in its geometry, the dome is more than a crown on a historic building. It's a symbol of unity, of cohesiveness, inspiring respect in those who applaud our republic. 36 windows ring the rotunda's circumference, set behind a cast iron peristyle of columns. This monumental colonnade provides a visually stable base to carry the 9 million pound dome, curving upward to the Statue of Freedom, crowning its summit. It's interesting to note that these noble Corinthian columns mime the solid weight-bearing stone columns of antiquity, but they are hollow, fabricated of cast iron. These are purely decorative elements, which themselves are supported on concealed iron brackets. They don't bear any of the tremendous weight of the great dome rising above. But if these columns weren't there at the base of the dome, it would look anemic, out of proportion. A famous architect in the 1800s, John Ruskin, said, "Remember that some of the most beautiful things in the world are the most useless. Peacocks and lilies, for instance. That is, for being music for our soul, that's basically its function." So this beautiful band of illusions at the base of the dome functions only as fireplace flues from member rooms below, and as rain leaders to siphon away the waters of Washington's storms. Also, the dome's design masks the fact that it's built of overlapping cast iron plates, not the classically inspired stone and tile construction it appears to be. So the full weight of the dome is in reality carried by the 96-foot diameter foundation wall built in the 1820s by the third architect of the Capitol, Charles Bulfinch. Anyone who spends time on Capitol Hill soon recognizes beneath that awe-inspiring dome, behind the Capitol's monumental sandstone and marble facade, dynamic currents of power push and pull those within its walls in waves, countercurrents, and irresistible undertows of dogma and political expediency. With this as a reality, years, even decades can pass before an urgent need finally ripens into a priority. For this need to come so sharply into focus that it can no longer be ignored or kicked down the road to await resolution by those yet to be elected. I'd always perceived the Capitol building as a single entity, a unified whole. It took me a while to understand that members of Congress see it as fundamentally split, divided at its core. The northern half of the Capitol is divided into meeting rooms and spaces supporting the 100 distinct companies in the Senate, and the southern into spaces for the 435 companies in the House of Representatives. Each of these members purport to represent his or her constituencies while swearing an oath to support our Constitution and our democracy against enemies both foreign and domestic. But just as the 36 columns at the base of the dome are hollow, architectural decorations only appearing to support the dome above, many members place their political survival above the Constitution they've sworn to uphold, and above any true commitment to e pluribus unum, out of many one. Like the hollow columns, their commitment to unity, to working together in the best interests of the nation is too often an illusion. But let's pause here to give you a sense of the responsibilities of the architect of the Capitol and the agency of the same name that she or he heads. It's part of the legislative branch of government, separate and distinct from the executive branch. And it's the steward of all the buildings and grounds on Capitol Hill on behalf of the Congress and the nation. This aerial photo captures basically the core of the jurisdiction. Here you see the Capitol building itself being prepared for an inaugural in the year 2001. So the stands that are being set up, the seating will ultimately be put in over here. Things are moving ahead. And on the east side of the Capitol, you can see construction going on the visitor center. Across the street is the Supreme Court, the Library of Congress in several buildings, the House office buildings on the right, Senate office buildings on the left. But we've just talked about this slide and the importance of the dome itself and how it's evolved over the years. This slide talks to the jurisdiction of the architect of the Capitol, not only the Capitol building itself, the Supreme Court, Library of Congress, all of its buildings, the Senate office buildings and the House office buildings here, the Senate office buildings across. It's some 18 million square feet of space and 500 acres of land. Here we see a wonderful slide which was put together in 1993 by the Capitol Historical Society to celebrate the 200th anniversary of laying of the cornerstone by George Washington. At the bottom of the slide, you see the original design by William Thornton, which never had its dome built, but the expansion wings on either side were in fact built until Charles Bulfinch in 1829 built a new dome. And this dome was built under the aegis of President Madison because he wanted it to be seen from a greater distance than was allowed by the lower dome profile. And on top, of course, we see the dome we know today. It was designed by Thomas Eustick Walter in the 1850s. And it's really, he took the initiative to do this because he had been retained to do the expansions to the entire Capitol building because of the growth in our country between 1800 and 1849. The numbers of Congress had more than doubled from 138 to 292 people in the span of 50 years, with the additions of new states. That was Arkansas and Michigan and Florida, Texas, Iowa, Wisconsin, California. I won't ask you to repeat that, but 7 major states. And here we see the drawing that Walter designed with the brand new dome, giving us a better sense of proportion over the building, which now stretched out to be 750 feet long instead of the 400 feet long it was before he got involved with the design. Maxwell House Coffee. You may ask what this has to do with the dome and the Capitol that we're talking about. I found out when I first became architect of the Capitol that there were lots of problems with the dome, that it was leaking. And one of the reasons it was leaking was when the sun came up on the east in the morning, it heated up the cast iron. And when it moved to the south, it cooled it. So these plates were creaking and opening up and allowing water to come through. So early in my tenure, I confirmed the concerns that this constant expansion and contraction resulted in water penetration and took a terrible toll on the dome, resulting in rusting. And my challenge was to request additional funding in an already large $300 million budget so I could continue my repair work and investigation. Trying to get another $7 million into the budget was very difficult. So at my budget hearing, I presented the senators with broken pieces of cast iron that had fallen from the dome and a Maxwell House coffee can full, not of coffee, but of rust gathered from the dome. My strategy was to circulate the coffee can among the appropriators so they could personally lift it and peer into, find that 2 pounds of coffee had been replaced with 10 pounds of much heavier rust. My message was simply, members of Congress, our dome is in your hands. The senators were sympathetic, but they'd had a budget cap that they couldn't exceed. The chairman fortunately found a way around the problem by tacking $7 million onto an $8 billion emergency flood relief bill passed to mitigate destruction across several states. I then performed a detailed inspection, prepared a master plan to repair some 1,200 cracks, broken and rusted out bolts, and recast pieces of cast iron that had fallen off. Also, we had to remove tons of red lead-based paint applied over the years. The Congress recognized the multiple risks, but they did not act. They spent years before the money was actually appropriated. And I spent many long nights visualizing chunks of cast iron cascading down the dome surface, causing horrific accidents. It was no exaggeration to say that rust was the only thing holding the railing together at the top of the dome, and rust could yield to the force of gravity at any time. I also knew that if this happened, those in Congress who had denied my funding would quickly blame me for poor stewardship and dereliction of duty. My successor, Stephen Ayers, was finally granted the necessary funding a dozen years later. Spanning the tenures of 3 architects, this multi-phase, quarter-century-long dome project speaks to the importance of continuity and the enormous difficulty of getting funding to maintain these priceless treasures, as each architect builds on the efforts of his or her predecessor for the good of our historic structures. One of my first lessons on Capitol Hill was effectively an 11th commandment, almost as important as the first. It could roughly be rendered as, "Thou shalt not gore my parking spot." At my own peril would I forget the importance of providing ample and convenient parking to members of Congress and their senior staff who have the power to impact budgets and agency operations. This 1958 image shows hundreds of cars crammed onto the east front of the Capitol. This cracked asphalt lot was disrespectful to our nation's capital, with my predecessor, George White, comparing it to a supermarket parking lot. We can also see the 1958 expansion of the East Front, which was generated by the need for additional congressional space and accomplished by building a replica of the deteriorating sandstone facade 32-foot eastward, but by using more weather-resistant marble. Importantly, this expansion assumed that a 500-car garage would eventually be built under the plaza and therefore provided an access point for the Capitol into that future garage. While the garage was never built due to the security risk, it was fortuitous that this was at the perfect rotation and location for a transition from a future underground visitor center into the Capitol. Next slide. George, my predecessor, had long lobbied for funding to remove the parking and build an underground structure to respectfully welcome people to the Capitol. He initiated a design but did not receive funding to move ahead. Congress kept kicking the problem down the road, and millions of annual visitors paid the price, having to wait as much as 3 hours for tours in rain and snow, with some fainting in Washington, D.C.'s hot summer sun. But security became an even more critical problem. In 1998, a deranged man walked into the Capitol, gun in hand, and murdered 2 Capitol police officers. He had come in search of a ruby satellite system that he imagined was hidden in a great safe in the Senate. He told a psychiatrist that he needed to find this system so that he could be transported back in time when he would no longer be deceased. A lying-in honor ceremony was held in the Capitol Rotunda for officers J.J. Chestnut and Detective John Gibson. Flags were flown at half-staff over the Capitol. This gross breach of Capitol security created new interest in a Capitol expansion to welcome and screen all in safety. Newt Gingrich, the House Speaker, was always concerned with the political risks of expending appropriated funds, but was now willing to support screening visitors at a safe distance from Capitol entrances. He proposed a compromise, raising $100 million through private donations to match $100 million in appropriated funds. The Pew Charitable Trust spearheaded this fundraising design, which stalled at raising $39 million due to the naming rights that could not be granted for donations, such as naming a space the Bob Hope Memorial Auditorium. Many of us here today remember the morning of September 11th, 2001, when we were horrified by TV images of people running in panic, of the stunned voices of reporters describing devastating scenes in New York after 2 planes crashed into the towers of the World Trade Center, and the towers collapsed, killing thousands. Then a third attack, this time on the Pentagon, just outside Washington and Virginia. This was quickly followed by police warnings that yet another plane had been hijacked and was heading toward Washington, United Flight 93. This is the flight path of the United 93, originating in Newark, New Jersey. And after it took off, 4 minutes later, the first plane hit the World Trade Center. 17 minutes later, another plane hit the other tower of the World Trade Center. And then ultimately the plane was hijacked, and instead of heading on to San Francisco, it was turned around and headed right towards Washington, D.C. The 40 heroes on that flight tried to take the plane down and bring control of it back into their hands. But it went down under Shanksville, Pennsylvania, in the middle of Pennsylvania, and 18 minutes out from flying time from Washington, D.C. Police officers rushed from office to office, ordering people to evacuate the Capitol immediately. It was totally chaotic as members and their staff scrambled down stairways toward the western door. Through the same corridors, presidents-elect walk on their way to inaugural ceremonies. They ran alone, in pairs, in small groups out to the National Mall. The only sounds that of rushing footfalls. Some ran out of their shoes without stopping to reclaim them. Some didn't know a third plane had crashed into the Pentagon until they saw clouds of black smoke wafting across the mall. Just weeks later, an intern for Senator Tom Daschle of South Dakota opened an envelope from the senator's pile of letters and found a terrorist's handwritten note along with a fine white powder that spilled onto her desk and clothing. It was soon found to be a virulent dose of anthrax spores, which contaminated the Hart Senate office building and the pathway that mail carts followed throughout Capitol Hill. It took months to remediate the building to kill the anthrax spores by injecting chlorine dioxide gas into the huge volume of the Hart Senate office building. 50 senators and their staffs were relocated to temporary spaces. The business of the Senate and the entire Congress was basically halted. But these new attacks greatly decreased the political risk of using appropriated funds for security, including the design and construction of the visitor center. Speaker Gingrich shut down the private fundraising campaign for Democracy's Front Door and agreed to increase appropriated funding. Congress directed me to add major House and Senate expansion spaces to the project, including the two-story House committee meeting room. This, of course, required changes in designs of our structural framing, increased public exiting needs, air conditioning systems, etc. These changes greatly impacted cost, contractor coordination, and the overall schedule. Ultimately, congressional space accounted for more than 50% of the new expansion, turning the project into a House and Senate meeting building as much as a public visitor center. But overwhelmingly, the need for increased security was the driving force behind the Capitol expansion. The Capitol Police Chief during the project, Terry Gaynor, said the design morphed with the evolving threats. What would someone want to do 10 years from now? And how prepared would we be for that? How would an enemy penetrate? How would he bring material in? How would he attack? We played out each one of these scenarios, but no security improvements we planned for anticipated the countering the threats of thousands of insurrectionists attacking the Capitol from all sides. And plans didn't include creating a process to secure quick assistance for the Capitol Police from its law enforcement partners controlled by the executive branch of government. In reality, I believe that the only way to protect our government from domestic threats is to lower the rhetoric that is polarizing our nation into separate camps, camps that seem incapable of mutual respect and a willingness to reach compromises for the common good. This is why I've always said the Capitol Visitor Center consisted of two separate but connected challenges. The first challenge was to design an underground expansion compatible with the Capitol itself, sensitively relating to its monumental scale and its neoclassical design and the quality of its materials, while critically providing increased levels of security and visitor comfort. But the other, far more difficult challenge was to provide for visitor education. Considering the diverse political, cultural, and religious perspectives represented by the Congress, the other project was destined to flex and shift with ever-changing pressure points of power that would determine whose version of congressional history would be taught. This is where heavy politics came in. Civic education has always been a major goal of ours, in the hope that the next generation of voters would be prepared for their roles in a strengthened democracy, surely a goal we all share. This included education about congressional history, the legislative process, and the mechanics of our representative democracy. The Visitor Center Exhibition Hall provides many meaningful civics programs, both in person and virtual, for kids ages 5 to 105, such as this experiential, touchable model of the dome, which enables people to appreciate its scale and its detail before they actually enter the historic Capitol for their tour. Participants can also analyze debates and compromises hammered out during the creation of our government, can learn to examine both sides of an issue, discuss the impacts of decisions, and classes of 8th graders and beyond can even try their hands at debating and passing legislation. They can track their representatives' voting record, better understand choices made that affect their communities. There's much more we must do. I'm concerned that as a nation, we have largely failed to prepare young Americans for self-government, leaving our democracy in danger. After years of polarization, our nation is divided and there's widespread loss of confidence in government. As November approaches, let's imagine what broad participation and voting by informed citizens of all backgrounds and beliefs could look like. Let's consider what more we can do to support that goal. It's my hope that educators nationally will receive the support they need to transform the teaching of history and civics to meet the needs of a diverse 21st century student population. But let's get back to the design of the physical visitor center. Our aesthetic vision was shaped by the importance of respecting the integrity of two historic landmarks, the Capitol building itself and the Capitol grounds, designed by Frederick Law Olmsted. This is a view of the east front of the Capitol, showing the old asphalt parking lot. We were directed to excavate as large a footprint as practicable to provide not only for the needs of the visitor center, but also for future expansion needs of the House and the Senate. Superimposed here in yellow is the outline of the largest excavation we could accomplish between the Capitol on the west and the Olmsted landscape on the east. It's important to note that we plan to excavate a 70-foot deep hole within 6 feet of the Capitol's 230-year-old foundations. This was going to be a multi-year construction process, and the Congress was going to be in session the entire time. This is quite a trick when you consider we excavated some 60,000 truckloads of earth and clay and built foundation walls directly contiguous to the Capitol. Our team focused on creating a unique addition, one that was architecturally compatible with the historic neoclassical Capitol, but didn't copy it or clone it. The next series of images are drawings that formed part of our vision. Here we see a site plan with the Capitol in the background and the East Plaza as it ultimately would be designed. And we see the eggs on the north and on the south that were designed by Mr. Olmsted. These are skylights, and these pair of skylights accentuates what is below in Emancipation Hall, and additional skylights bring light down into a building which critics indicated could not possibly be welcoming because it was underground, and I think we proved them wrong. Here we see the continuation of East Capitol Street on the road to the Rotunda stairs and ramps on both sides for ADA compliance, and the tulip poplar allays of trees on both sides. We see symmetry, which must be achieved on both sides of the east-west axis that divides the Capitol in half. Here we see a rendering of East Capitol Street leading to the Rotunda steps, that ramp, the alley of tulip poplars, and the desire to keep the vision of the Capitol wide open as we moved ahead to allow people to come in and be screened remotely. This is where the screening facility is, at the bottom of the ramps, the stairways, and the stairways coming from the East Plaza, always allowing people to know what their ultimate destination was, which is basically the Capitol building itself. Once you go through screening over here, you come out on basically a mezzanine area. This rendering shows that mezzanine area with a visitor looking down on Emancipation Hall and looking through that skylight to see the dome. This area is flooded with natural light and really successfully brings a sense of procession to the visitors. They know where they are, they know where they're going. We talked before about the false columns at the base of the Capitol dome itself. Here we see paired columns marching down the Emancipation Hall space. Interesting to note, this is a real column on the left. The columns on the right are false. Column is real on the left. On the right, it is false. And this was basically to give a rhythm to the space below, something aesthetically that gives us a sense of progression, of the scale of the space itself, which is 80 feet by 200 feet long and 30 feet high. The space between the Orientation Theater on the left and the Orientation Theater on the right was carved out to ultimately show the Statue of Freedom model, which became the focal point for the visitor center. I was only in office some 4 months or so when Senator Akaka of Hawaii came to my office and asked that we move it from the Senate office building basement to the Capitol Visitor Center here. And we did that, and really the scale of it makes the visitor center wonderful. All of the spaces that serve the visitors basically pinwheel off of Emancipation Hall. We see the entrance to the exhibition hall behind the statue, the orientation theaters, the cafe. All of this makes sense and essentially was the fruit of our labors of building this. But the question is, how did we build it? And the answer to that, of course, is carefully. We see a 70-foot excavation over here with the new foundation wall having been built. We see a worker at the lower left beginning to raise the first steel beam into place to support the roof of what would be rebuilt as the East Plaza. I had nightmares through this excavation process, visualizing the Capitol sliding into this abyss that we had created here. But we were really very careful using a slurry wall construction process where which the earth remained over here after the wall had been poured into a long slot. And as we excavated the earth, we basically put long screws, 130-foot long screws, beneath the Capitol to make sure that it would hold as we continued the excavation. Then we go down another 14 feet or so and put more screws beneath the Capitol until we finally reached our 70-foot length. This basically shows us the full Capitol excavation site. Here we see that transition space that we talked about before, built originally for the garage that was never built here. Here we see expansion space for the House of Representatives, the roof beginning to go on over here, expansion space for the Senate, and mostly the central space was for the visitors. This is a close-up of that space, and it shows the steel going up, the roof being put on, and the stairs to the rotunda being taken apart so that we could build a space where the escalators and the stairs from the visitor center could go up and enter into the Capitol building. But as we built this new expansion, I reflected on the fact that slaves had played critical roles in constructing earlier phases of the Capitol. And this had been little recognized by history. An effort to begin to rectify this resulted in the creation of a special task force on slave labor. I was honored to serve on that task force with Congressman John Lewis of Georgia, an icon of the civil rights movement, to review the history and contributions of slave laborers in the construction of the Capitol. During a debate about placing a marker in Emancipation Hall to acknowledge the role that slave labor played, Congressman Lewis declared, "Slavery is part of our nation's history, of which we are not proud. However, we shall not run or hide from it. The history of the Capitol, like the history of our nation, should be complete. This untold story will now be told thanks to the work of the Slave Labor Task Force. We will now honor these slaves who built our Temple of Freedom." Mr. Lewis was a very special human being. Life in the capital brought with it a wealth of challenges, punctuated along the way with memorable moments in time. The architect of the Capitol is tasked with preparations for many notable events, including Congressional Gold Medal awards, lying in state ceremonies, coordinating presidential inaugurals. I had the honor of welcoming Mother Teresa to the Capitol for her gold medal ceremony, and this was in June of 1997, when her cortege stopped in front of our greeting party on the Capitol's plaza. We were told that she was just out of the hospital and very frail, and instructed us not to shake her hand, but simply reach out ours towards her. She was draped in her customary white sari, edged with the 3 blue stripes of the Order of the Missionaries of Charity. I leaned toward her, offering my right hand to this woman whose life of sacrifice and devotion to millions of sick and needy was respected throughout the world. She appeared incredibly small, her deeply lined face easily recognizable beneath her blue striped headdress. Time-warm fingers of her left hand slipped beneath mine as she placed her right hand on top, embracing my hand between hers. She bowed her head as a flow of energy coursed from her hands through mine. A long moment passed. She released my hand, and I stepped back as she moved on to the next person. In the rotunda, she spoke slowly, thoughtfully, but somehow her voice resonated throughout the immense volume of this 180-foot-high space. Her voice rang with clarity, imbued with an aura of humility and grace. I was humbled to have been ever so briefly in the presence of this pure soul. Let me suggest that you think of presidential inaugurations as yet another event on our national stage. Every 4 years, the west front of the Capitol is where we enact a core part of our democracy, the peaceful transfer of power from one president to the next, as the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court administers the oath of office. Washington's weather in January is difficult to predict, and on January 19th, 2001, a snowstorm passed through Washington. This wonderful aerial view was taken before the snow was cleared for the next day's inaugural swearing in with the help of the National Guard. It highlights the seating pattern and the breadth of inaugural preparations. 2 weeks before the planned inauguration on January 6th, 2001, I sat in the House chamber to the left of the rostrum, together with the House and Senate Sergeants at Arms and the Secretary of the Senate. This constitutionally mandated session was held to formalize the selection of the next president and vice president, and was the culmination of the political rancor that had divided the nation since the inconclusive election 2 months earlier. The outcome was settled by the Supreme Court in favor of George W. Bush and Dick Cheney in Bush versus Gore, when it effectively foreclosed hand counting the incompletely punched ballots of 4 Florida counties, called the Hanging Chads. Many of you clearly remember how this ended Vice President Gore's efforts to win the state's popular vote and therefore the presidency. In his capacity as president of the Senate, Gore presided as chairman of the counting of the state electoral votes. Members of the Congressional Black Caucus tried to raise points of order objecting to the Florida vote, but to no avail, since no senator had co-signed the point of order. Illinois Representative Jesse Jackson Jr. shouted, "It's a sad day in America, Mr. President." You may remember the moment. Gore, with arms spread wide and a frustrated half smile, said, "The president thanks the gentleman from Illinois, but," he paused, and appearing to be unable to find an appropriate response, he smiled and said in a questioning tone, "Hey," saying in effect, "I can't do anything. I'm sorry." In conceding, Gore said, "I will honor the new president-elect and do everything possible to help him bring Americans together in fulfillment of the great vision that our Declaration of Independence defines and that our Constitution affirms and defends." I believe many in the chamber on that day of both parties regarded this man with respect for his bearing, integrity, and love of country. I certainly did. His 2001 counting of the electoral votes was an important moment in our nation's history, but it was not the first time this constitutional formality had been contested or even imperiled in the sacred halls of the Capitol, nor would it be the last. On February 13, 1861, a joint session of Congress convened to formally count the electoral votes of the 1860 presidential election won by Abraham Lincoln. John Breckinridge of Kentucky was VP at that time, and he faithfully honored his oath of office to protect the Union by presiding over the counting in support of the peaceful transfer of power, despite soon joining the Confederacy and becoming its Secretary of War. In recounting here my personal experiences as an officer of Congress, observing the 2001 counting of electoral votes, one who also swore an oath of office to support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic, I am compelled to contrast those events with those of 2021, when insurrectionists violated the same chambers, corridors, and halls I swore to maintain and protect. A rampaging mob of thousands of insurrectionists marched down Constitution Avenue from a White House speech, smashed their way into the Capitol at 9 separate windows and doors, desecrating it in search of the House chamber to stop the counting of the electoral votes. They violated the same rotunda where presidents lie in state, where Mother Teresa, Martin Luther King, the Dalai Lama, and Ronald Reagan were awarded the Congressional Gold Medal, Congress's highest honor. I felt gut punched as I watched the videos of this attack in the Capitol's halls and chambers. Like Breckinridge in 1861 and Gore in 2001, Vice President Mike Pence stood at the House dais in 2021 following a divisive and heavily contested election, and despite being told by his president to overturn the electoral votes in battleground states, Pence honored his oath of office and presided over the joint session of Congress, confirming Biden's win. During my 10-year term of office, I served as a member of the U.S. Capitol Police Board, charged with overseeing the 2,000-person force and their security planning to protect the Congress. But never in our planning had we conceived of the possibility of thousands of citizens and insurrectionists attacking the Capitol to overturn the results of a presidential election that had been certified as legitimate by the governments of all 50 states. 140 officers were injured, 1 died in this attack, and 4 more died by suicide in the following weeks. While significant threat scenarios had been played out by the Capitol Police during my tenure, they did not include plans to counter the threat of thousands of insurrectionists attacking the Capitol from all sides. Going forward, as a private citizen, it's impossible to predict what a new normalcy will look like in Washington and on Capitol Hill. Impossible to predict what new measures Congress will authorize over the months and years to come as officials continue to investigate and call for strengthened security. Going forward, it's clear that to protect our country, we must not only reevaluate security provisions, but must also work together to foster respect for our Constitution, for truth, for our precious but fragile democratic institutions. The ongoing story of building, expanding, and repairing the Capitol is threaded through the core of our nation's history, having a critical impact on the stewardship role of its architects. Despite political battles, the Capitol's designers and builders succeeded in blending more than 230 years of growth and change into a cohesive visual whole. We strove to follow in their footsteps with the support of key members of Congress. Upon the opening of the Visitor Center, a newspaper editorial called it a beautiful facility that is worthy of the Capitol. It honors the original. Those are exactly the sentiments we strove to achieve throughout our efforts. The position of architect of the Capitol is a magnificent challenge. When walking the Capitol's corridors at night, I found that a historical presence radiated from its walls as I followed in the footsteps of my predecessors, of generations of representatives, senators, and presidents who shaped our centuries-long flow of democracy. I was honored and humbled by the responsibility of walking those corridors as an officer of Congress, as I hope future architects will be, contributing as best they can to the ongoing chronicle of the Capitol, the worldwide symbol of our nation. I've tried to relate from my 10-year slice of history to similar issues in our country experienced during the 230-year continuum since the 1787 Constitutional Convention held in Philadelphia. At that convention, Benjamin Franklin was asked what sort of government the delegates had created, and he responded, "A republic, if you can keep it." Our nation has persevered and flourished through great challenges, but Franklin was prescient in recognizing that this republic can only be kept if people of goodwill respect the Constitution, their right to vote, to select our leaders, and are actively involved in protecting everyone's freedoms, despite our differences. Our country has overcome many crises, and we continue to do so if we all remain involved.
Story, and what a life. You certainly have had adventures. So Alan, we're a little close to the end of our time because we had a little bit of a technical difficulty. So we've got two questions we want to put to you. One is, our listeners are interested. You talked about the fact that this was designed so that there would be an opportunity for expansion. What would it take? We have 435 members of the House, and we still have had population growth, but we haven't increased the number of House members. What would it take to the physical building to increase the size of the House of Representatives, or to accommodate a larger number of representatives?
When in designing the visitor center, we built as big a footprint as we possibly could, delineated by the Capitol building, of course, on the west, and Olmsted's landscape. That footprint is set now, and as I see it, because of the historic nature of the Capitol building, the physical building itself cannot be expanded. Certainly, one of the things we had hoped was that the congressional auditorium that we built would have been built at a size of 750 seats instead of the size of 450 seats, so that larger groupings could in fact meet for the House or the Senate, or in fact have a joint session of Congress while we went out to perhaps renovate the House chamber or the Senate chamber, which are in need of updating and renovating. But in terms of more members, when you look at joint sessions of Congress, it holds the entire population of the House, 435 members. It holds 100 senators. It holds visiting dignitaries and visitors at the top. So I think that there are enough seats, there's enough room to increase from 435 members, but I would just predict that the number of members would stay the same, and that the number of people reporting, or essentially being in the constituency for each member, will just go up from, I think it's something like 780,000 per member at this point in time. I don't see more members coming in, but that's basically just my perspective.
And one final question: as you were digging up under the ground, did you find any artifacts that are of note?
Interesting. Our project was actually held up at one point because we found a cistern which had been used during the early construction days of the first elements of the Capitol. That cistern lay right in the middle of where we were building that foundation wall. So we photographed it. We took all kinds of concerns into account, and then removed the cistern, continued to build the wall. There had been some water storage facilities also on the east front, which we took care of with respect to historic preservation standards. We photographed it, measured it, documented it. Other than that, there were no other historic elements that we really encountered in the construction of this visitor center.
Well, Alan, thank you so much for taking the time to share this story with us and share the pictures. We will be sending to people the information about how to purchase your book. So for anyone who has additional questions, opportunities are there to read the book. This session has been videotaped and will be available for our listeners. We always use this moment to thank you for tuning in, for supporting the society. As I say at the start, the society was chartered by Congress, but is funded by the citizenry who donate and who are our members and supporters. And for each and every one of you, we are grateful. We hope that you will share the opportunity with friends and neighbors to join our dedicated group of people who really care about the Capitol, the democracy that it is the symbol of, and the work that goes on in that building each and every day. Alan Hantman, you are one of America's heroes. Thank you for your work. Thank you for your time. We appreciate all of you tuning in, and we have some interesting things coming up. This is a moment when we do our promotion about coming up soon. We have on Thursday, May 9th, a graphic novel written by a Harvard professor. Who would think that a Harvard professor would write a graphic novel, AKA a comic book, where he looks at what would have happened if the January 6th mob that took over the Capitol or tried to take over the Capitol had succeeded in really taking it over for the long term. Then we have coming up, we return to our series about the Constitution and the amendments. That is the amendments about prohibition. We prohibited alcohol, then we decided, oh no,